Hey there. There was a good question on Facebook from Christoph about information structure. And since I couldn't sleep, and since it was a really good question and it kind of wrestled with the same kinds of things I remember wrestling with, where you're trying to keep six different plates spinning at once and you're trying to figure out, like, why isn't it working? Or everything seems to be working in this particular way. So what I wanted to do was pull up a slideshow from a paper I gave at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. There was a linguistics in Greek language conference last summer, so April 2019, I think. And it's a forthcoming volume from Baker, so you can keep an eye out for that, edited by David Allen Black and Ben Merkel. But what I want to do is just go through part of this slide deck to kind of illustrate things. I'll go ahead and share the screen, and then we'll see what, this is not meant to provide an exhaustive introduction information structure, but hopefully can give us a sense. The easiest way to think about information structure for me, or to introduce the idea, is to watch Yoda. Because in the Star Wars movies, Yoda's character basically follows Greek information structure in terms of how he uses information and how he structures it. So let's go ahead and watch this video. I'm going to stop it at parts and comment on it. But the key thing is to listen to the status of the information. Like, is what he emphasizes, what he places first, most important, or is it just signaling a transition?
Hello. I'm sorry to disturb you, Master.
What help can I be, Obi-Wan?
I'm looking for a planet described to me by an old friend. I trust him, but the systems don't show in the archive maps.
Lost a planet, Master Obi-Wan has. How embarrassing.
Hello.
Oh.
I'm sorry to disturb you, Master.
So you had this statement about lost a planet he has. In English, in natural English, we would talk about he's lost a planet, but instead Yoda takes the most important part of the predicate and puts it at the beginning of the clause, like you would do in Greek.
Help can I be, Obi-Wan?
I'm looking for a planet described to me by an old friend. I trust him, but the systems don't show in the archive maps.
Lost a planet, Master Obi-Wan has. How embarrassing.
So losing the planet's the most important part.
Liam, the shades. Gather round the map reader. Clear your minds. And find Obi-Wan's wayward planet we will.
And find the planet you will, instead of he will find the planet.
Here. But it isn't. Gravity is pulling all the stars in the area towards this spot.
Gravity's silhouette remains, but the star and all the planets disappeared they have.
Disappeared they have. They have disappeared. Disappearing is the most important part.
Anyone?
Master? Because someone erased it from the archive memory.
Truly wonderful the mind of a child is. The Padawan is right. Go to the center of gravity's pull and find your planet. You will.
It's important there. Not every sentence is put into a different order. Some of the sentences were in standard order, like what you'd have in English, but when he wants to emphasize something, and what was most interesting is the last bit. What he wanted to emphasize is the verb. And typically, since the verb in Greek and in Hebrew and many other languages comes at the beginning, you can't front it, right? Because that's its default position. So the place you would put this, as Yoda did, is at the end of the clause, and you would signal, so it's not to say that every verb at the end of the clause is in marked focus, but the point is, Intonation would accomplish that. So let's listen to that section again, because that's an important part that I don't talk about in the discourse grammar, but it's very much present.
Planet, you will. And find your planet center of gravity's pull. And find your planet.
You will. Okay.
Hello.
Okay, so in terms of how the principles work, or what are the principles, there's an idea of natural information flow. And in the fuller presentation, we would take some time to go through that. The tendency to go from what's most known to what's least known. And in Greek, we would expect that basically it's a verb prominent language. So you'd expect the verb to be the beginning of natural information flow. And then you would go with the next most known informations, which would be pronominal entities. And we're not talking about simply like personal pronouns, but it could be personal pronouns that are objects of prepositions. So prepositional phrases could come immediately after the verb. It could be a subject pronoun. It could be an object pronoun. The parentheses there are to signal that these are optional. They may or may not be present. If they are present, they're expected. This is not a rule, but in terms of principle, from a principle standpoint, they're expected to occur here, followed by the object and indirect object. So just a couple examples here from John 15:15 to illustrate this, where you have humas and avto immediately following the verb. And if you want to read more about this, Stephen Levinson's Discourse Features volume 2000, page 29, and following, his ordering principles are what are critical. Basically, they're just like text critical principles in the sense that they end up contradicting each other at points, and that they're competing values. That it's not so much that you can just predict how things are. So the placement of the pronominal constituents immediately after the verb by default. Ordering principle 2 predicts that core arguments like your subjects and objects would occur before the peripheral ones, meaning like prepositional phrases. And then principle 3 predicts that propositional topics like subjects will precede nonverbal constituents of the predicate. So you'd expect that subjects would precede objects and prepositional phrases. So here's an example. The layout is taken from the Lexham Discourse Greek New Testament. The basic idea is it's just kind of like the phrasing diagrams, where if you have a dependent element, it's indented one level. So we have a participial clause, so that's dependent. We have a relative clause here, that's dependent. So both of those are indented just to reflect the dependency relationship. We've indented it and labeled. But again, we have prepositional phrases, a prepositional phrase that immediately follows the verb. We have a demonstrative pronoun. So it's not always going to be a subject pronoun. And here you even have tuto, which indirect object, preceding the subject. And if you look at Helmut Diek's work and others who are using Simon Diek's functional discourse grammar model, which I adopt. I mean, typologically, that's how things work. But the problem is, without looking at things from a cognitive standpoint, like natural information flow, you can't account for pronouns, and you count it, for these kinds of anomalies. And that's where it's important to have a holistic model. And that's difficult to do working strictly within a single field. Now role and reference grammar and other fields, functional models have overcome that. Construction grammar with Knut Lambrecht. But if you're working primarily from a structural standpoint, or the SSA semantic and structural analyses, again, tend to be more structurally oriented or semantically oriented, as the names say, not and have problems accounting for cognitive factors like this. So what about violating natural information flow? If we had our default of the verb marking the beginning of the the predicate, natural information flow following, when you violate it, according to Simon Dieck, you basically have two optional spots. P1 and P2 is what he called them in his first iteration of this model in 1984. P1 is a theoretical construct to describe established or cognitively accessible information. So established meaning you've read about it earlier in the discourse, or accessible meaning from either your world experience, encyclopedic knowledge, understanding of culture, and those idiomatic things that we kind of, not idiomatic, but those elements that we bootstrap from our human experience. That kind of information would tend to be, if we saw that kind of information, we would expect that this is P1, or what in the discourse grammar I call a frame of reference, or what Levinson calls a point of departure, what Randall Booth calls a contextualizing constituent, and what most people simply, or what a lot of linguistics literature will just talk about topicalization or topic. But the problem is topicalization makes it sound like it's primarily talking subject information, not comparative, not conditional information, not temporal information. So P1, the P1 information provides a frame of reference for what follows. It does two important things. So one is it tells you how to relate what precedes to what follows. The primary basis for processing what follows, the frame of reference for what follows, is a change of subject, or a change of time, a change of place. But it also provides a cohesive linkage at a transition. So you actually have, based on the switch of time, place, participants, or kind of action, there's technically a discontinuity there. So we could think of that as scissors have cut the discourse into little, into two pieces. Well, a frame of reference ends up being like tape or Velcro to put things back together. So yes, you have a transition, but it provides a cohesive link, and that's what gives you coherence in the overall discourse. P2, this is the theoretical location for what's newly asserted, or the most salient information in a clause. So regardless of where it occurred in the clause, it was already the most important. The placement at the beginning of the verb, or the preverbal placement, simply adds more prominence. It was already the most important information, but by fronting it, placing it before the verb, it adds even more prominence. So the only difference between P1 and P2, these theoretical constructs of Simon Dieck, is the status of the information. It's not a positional thing. If both are present, I remember the parentheses say they're not obligatory. So if both are present, we would expect P1 to precede P2. But if you only had one element there, the question is, which is it? Is it a frame of reference, or is it something that's been fronted to emphasize it, to add prominence to it? And that's where, again, discourse context and what you've read so far is critically important. And you say, well, what's the deal with the pronoun? Well, the pronoun is there sometimes to help disambiguate, I think. There are lots of different reasons people have postulated. But what I've found, one of the explanations I found satisfying is that the fronting of the pronoun it only occurs with a P2 element. And that basically what it would do is help disambiguate whether something that's been fronted is a frame of reference or is in marked focus in P2. Remember we said that verbs start the beginning of natural information flow, and we would expect the pronouns to immediately follow, right? When you have a P2 element at the beginning, you have a fronted focal constituent. That fronted focal constituent now becomes the beginning of natural information flow. And so that's, I think, why you find pronouns there, because what you end up having is it adds more of a stark contrast. If that P2 element is the most new part of the clause, the way you can really highlight that is to put the most known bit of information immediately following it, which is pronominal constituents. So information status. Propositions, so we're talking topic comment clauses here, but pretty much any clause, this would be true, except for presentational clauses or thetic clauses. But propositions tend to be a mix of what's presupposed, so old or established, that pragmatically inferable information, to be a mixture of what's presupposed and what's newly asserted. The presupposed information provides the basis for processing the new information. So if I talk about, I think, let's take a look at some examples here. And questions are critically important for understanding information structure from a cognitive standpoint. People have different reasons for wanting to look at information structure, and people that are coming from more of a structural standpoint or a semantic standpoint have different goals and objectives than cognitive linguists, even though they use the same kind of terminology and talking about topic and focus and things. That's how they end up meaning something different, because they're after something. They're trying to answer different questions. Questions are a great way of sussing out what is newly asserted. According to Knut Lambrecht's definition of focus, so the way I use focus would be the difference between what is pragmatically presupposed, that discourse old, or what's inferable from one's world knowledge. So the difference between what's pragmatically presupposed and what's newly asserted in the clause. So it's that difference. Sometimes you can't even isolate the words that are that. It's some other piece. It's not just these words are new because they haven't been mentioned in the discourse. You could have words that have been mentioned before, but if they're asserting something new and it's adding some new bit, then that would qualify as being focal. So in answer to the question, who gave you that book? We have a pragmatically presupposed proposition that someone gave the book to me. That's known and established. The question is who, and so the interrogative, whatever fills in the answer to the who interrogative pronoun, that's what is focal in this context. So in English, I would communicate that with primary sentence intonation. Bob gave me the book. But since gave me the book is pragmatically presupposed, we typically just elide it and just say Bob, or Bob did. And notice primary sentence intonation, Bob did. We can do a marked focal constituent, which in Greek is much easier, but in English, we have to use what's called a cleft construction, or an it cleft. Basically, we have to have a dummy subject. English requires that P1, one way of Levinson has said we can think of English as P1 is an obligatory element. It must be filled. That's why we have dummy subjects like it. It was Bob who gave it to me. But we would only use this marked construction in a context where I was correcting someone, where where there was someone believed that it was Jill or Sue or someone else who gave me the book, not Bob. And again, because who gave it to me is pragmatically presupposed, a lot of times we would just leave that out. It was Bob. not someone else. But note what happens when I change the discourse context. I can have exactly the same expression in a different context, meaning what's pragmatically presupposed is different. Even though syntactically nothing has changed with the clause, it completely changes the information structure analysis. What did Bob give you? So here, what's pragmatically presupposed is Bob gave me something. The question is, what is it? And so whatever fills in the answer to the interrogative pronoun is what is focal. Bob gave me a book, or I'd simply say a book. And again, the marked form with the dummy subject would only be used in a context where you're correcting something. It was a book he gave me, not a backpack or a banana or something else. Let's take a look at an example from John 15, where you have a series of topic comment clauses, really quick switches of topic. So in traditional grammar, there are basically two reasons, two motivations ascribed to fronting something or placing something before the verb: emphasis and contrast. I guess I should say contrast and emphasis. Those actually align very, very well with what typologists and linguists have said about the two roles, P1, P2. Contrast, meaning a switch of some kind. We're going to talk more about contrast in a little bit, but contrast would align with this P1, where it's there to mark a switch or a frame of reference of some kind, and P2 aligning with emphasis, meaning taking what was already the most important part of the clause and placing it before the verb to add more prominence to it. But in these clauses, you have with ego and humis, homenon inimu kago in avto, avtos. So all of this is topical frames of reference, left dislocation, but still achieving that switch. I am the vine, you are the branches, the one who remains in me and I in him. This one bears much fruit. And then you have contextual information with horisemu. Apart from me or without me, you're not able to do anything. These all set up a frame of reference for the newly asserted information that follows. They are pragmatically presupposed or inferable. Apart from me may not have been known, but it's easy enough to understand. Conditions, same way. If anyone does not remain in me, that is setting up a condition that must be true, or that if it is true, if that holds true, then the proposition that follows holds true. The only thing you have in marked focus is the destination of these unfruitful branches, isto pur. So into the fire they are thrown. So again, you can just kind of think about Yoda's into the fire they're thrown. That fits well with how we would say it more naturally in English. He throws them into the fire. We would put sentence intonation, primary sentence intonation at the end of that clause. Well, what about dependent adverbial constituents? We've so far talked about like subjects and objects. What about like adverbial clauses, like participial clauses, condition, dependent clauses and such? Dependent adverbial constituents, whenever you choose to use a non-finite verb form, so infinitives, participles, and dependent clauses, you are making the choice to take what potentially could have otherwise been a series of independent simple clauses and to make them into one complex proposition. You're basically doing the equivalent of a grammatical group hug. by using dependent forms. I think that is probably the most overlooked, exegetically significant insight in why I should learn Greek, because 30 to 40% of the time, what are actually dependent clauses and dependent constructions in Greek are translated into English as though they're finite independent clauses. Now, that's fine because Greek is not English, and Greek relies much more heavily on participles than English. It wouldn't sound like natural English if you did translate them all exactly as they are in Greek. So I'm not beating up Bible translations, but what I'm saying is, if we just look at this and say, oh, this is an imperatival participle, we're missing the fact that there was a grammatical decision made to do this grammatical group hug, to make a complex thing, to only have one imperative, and to have these participial forms, like in Ephesians 5, 18 down through 2021. So when you've made the choice to have adverbial constituents, like these dependent forms, you've taken what could have potentially been independent clauses and made a grammatical group hug. In doing that, in making that choice, a second consequence of that is you need to anoint one of them as the king. What is the main clause? That king necessarily ends up becoming the main clause, the big idea around which all the rest hang. The main clause is the handle for the whole construction, and everything else is serving and playing some kind of role. The dependent clauses effectively are backgrounded. Doesn't mean they're unimportant, but they're serving this greater good, which is whatever the main clause is. Let's take a look at that in John 13:1. So we have a temporal expression, prodetes heortes tu Pascha. So before the feast of the Passover, so that's setting up a temporal frame of reference for what follows. That theoretically everything else that follows is now being processed as before the feast, and potentially setting up, this idea of what would come later. But then we have the series of participial clauses with idos and agapesas. You have a statement about Jesus knowing that his hour, knowing. You have a hoti clause describing what was known, hoti elthen avto he ora, and then a the hene clause describing what that hour is about, that he would depart in this world to the Father. And then we have a second circumstantial participle, agapesas tus idius tus into cosmo. So you have having or loving his own in the world. Now note that agapesas is the same lemma, agapao, as we have here in the main clause. Agapesin. I chose this on purpose because sometimes people will look at, as you're thinking about information structure and this definition of focus as it's the difference between what's pragmatically presupposed and what's newly asserted. Someone could look at this and say, well, gosh, John isn't asserting anything new because we already knew that Jesus loved his own, and that's what he's saying again. So the question is, why would he do this? Why would he put agapao both in a circumstantial frame of reference and also as the main verb? Well, by introducing more of that information, it leaves less new information in the main clause, which means effectively there's more of a spotlight on that new information, which in that sense, the only thing that's newly asserted is istelos. And so it was already what was most important, because that's all that's left to be newly asserted, but it's also been fronted with respect to the main verb, which by definition would put it in marked focus, or what I call the discourse grammar emphasis. So information structure is tricky, especially if you're looking at it to function in really concrete, black and white, new, old distinctions. Language is just messier than that. We want to communicate things more than that, more nuanced than that. Precisely what you see here with John. So even though at some level you could say there's really no new information in the main clause other than to the end, that's the point. John is narrowing it down so that that's all that's left, and that and not only that, but having structured this to where you have all of this information effectively backgrounded because of its dependency relationship. Again, that's another way that the spotlight has been focused on this clause, in terms of marking this as what's most salient in this larger construction. But then within this main clause, it's just istelos that's most salient and in marked focus. Okay, what about things like conditional clauses and purpose clauses and these other kinds of things? Holger Diessel has done some great work. He's a German typologist. And what he's found is that he's basically did a study of 40 different languages of the world, and was trying to find a simple answer about these kinds of adverbials occur here, these occur there. And shocking, it was more complex than that. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't that simple, but basically he found out he needed more nuanced explanations. And it's not simply, so here are the general principles. The clause initial adverbials, so whether they're participles, whether they're temporal adverbs, whether they're dependent clauses, they tend to be more pragmatically presupposed, meaning they're accessible. You wouldn't have known them, but they're easier to process. It's not some stunning new revelation. Second, it provides thematic grounding, or that frame of reference idea that I've talked about. And third, they tend to have a wider semantic scope. I mean, they could be about anything. I could talk about hunting and fishing and vacation before I talk about what I had for dinner. It doesn't have to have, I could say of all the time, of all the meals, camping and all, I could go to all these different contexts and then talk about like what I'm going to fix tonight. There tends to be a much wider scope, semantic scope possible for these things. So we can see this in John 13. And again, you have a tremendous amount of information that is effectively backgrounded through these dependency relationships, so that what that does is it places the spotlight on one action. This is the grammatical group hug. John could have just as easily said, there was a dinner taking place, and the devil, inhabited the heart of Judas, and Jesus knew that the Father had given him all things, and that he was going to the Father, and he got up from the dinner. What you would have done if those had all been independent clauses, they would have at face value been co-equal in terms of salience. By creating dependency relationships, doing that grammatical group hug, John has told us which of all of these different actions is the most important. Like, what is the big idea with respect to this one sentence? And it's Jesus gets up. All of the rest of this is to set the context, to set the stage, to set a frame of reference for this getting up. He didn't just get up randomly, but it's in the middle of this, or as this dinner was taking place, and in the context of the devil already having inhabited Judas to move to betray him, and also with this knowledge about the Father, that all things were in his hands, and that he was going to God. He gets up, so it makes it a much more dramatic thing, which is getting up, disrobing, and washing the disciples' feet. Okay, what about the clause final adverbials? The clause final adverbials tend to be newly asserted information in contrast, or at least less pragmatically presupposed. They tend to have a closer semantic connection, meaning they elaborate on the main verb. So they have this local semantic scope. So where the broader, you could have a description about most anything that's very broad with the preverbal ones, and then in the clause narrow down. Basically the clause final ones really can't go much beyond the scope of whatever the main verb is. There's a limitation to it. And this isn't just in German or English, this is a typological phenomenon. So we see this in John 6:19. So we have circumstantial frame of reference about having, rowed for 25 or 30 stadia. The main action is they see Jesus. So the rowing and seeing Jesus really don't have a tight semantic relationship. They have a tight chronological relationship. But look at what happens with Theorus and Ton Jesu. So you've also got a historical present. But the elaborating participles that follow describe essentially what they see. See him walking on the water and coming near the boat. So all of these things end up setting the stage. I mean, they're both technically adverbial participles. Some come before, some follow, but we see a difference, and Diesel's explanation is really helpful. These that follow tend to have a closer semantic relationship than those that precede. This was what was most interesting. Notice we're now in 2001 instead of 2003. Adverbial modifiers in OV languages like Korean and Turkish, I think Arabic, you will find adverbial modifiers only precede the verb, whereas in VO languages like English, German, Hebrew, and Greek, most European, many European languages are going to be VO languages. The adverbial modifiers can either precede or follow. And so the question is there anything we can know more about that? Well, what he found is that so what we have is a continuum here. So things that tend to be preposed most of the time versus things that tend to be postposed most of the time. So if there's something that is nearly always preposed before the verb, it would be conditional elements. Temporal clauses can either come before or after. Causal can come either before or after, but respectively they opt for one or the other, where reason, result, and purpose clauses typically come at the end. So the question, why is that? Well, some of that has to do with the content it conveys, because conditionals have to do with the truth conditionality of, they affect the truth conditionality of the main proposition. They typically are disclosed first. So if you answer my question, I'll buy you a steak dinner. If I put that condition at the end, it has the pragmatic effect of sounding like a gotcha. Because if I say, hey, I'll buy you a steak dinner, it makes it sound like there's no strings attached, because I've just made a commitment to buy you a steak dinner. But placing it at the end, I'll buy you a steak dinner if you'll answer my question. It's like I've just given you something and then taken it back until the condition is met. So that just illustrates a bit about why some of these things are tend to come at the beginning. Temporal information can be used for framing purposes, but also it can be newly asserted, which would be why you find it at the beginning and the end. So there's reasons for it, but we can't just make blanket statements about all adverbials. I mean, typically P1, P2 elements, those principles hold true, but there are a number of different layers and factors that affect things. So we have one of the few reason result clauses that comes at the beginning of the clause. Jesus is referring back to what he's just told his disciples, and he's told them that they feel sorrow, or what he wants to basically say is, they know he's told them these things, but what he wants to do is make a comment about what effect those have had. So you have because I've said these things to you, sorrow has filled your hearts. But most oftentimes you'll find the reason result supporting the main clause, following it instead of preceding. Okay, finally to what Christoph asked about on Facebook. I'm going to kind of step back, and we've talked a little bit about information structure, but we also need to talk about contrast. Contrast is primarily determined by contextual factors. Sometimes people will talk about a contrastive de or a contrastive topic. Contrast is necessarily determined by contextual factors. You can take something out of its context and the contrast will go away. But in order for there to be contrast, you need two parallel entities. Like between the two propositions, you need some kind of a connection between them. So the parallelism is determined by at least one shared element. So basically you have time, place, participants, and kind of action are the four main kinds of differences. And so you need some kind of a connection. So in our example one, Bob eats bananas, Jill eats bananas too. The common ground is banana eating. And the contrast here, and not a huge contrast, is switching from Bob to Jill. Note that that's not really considered super contrastive, because it's just a simple switch of topic. Another example, I could have same subject but different activity. So instead of banana eating being the common thing, Bob is the common thing, and I'm making two statements. He's turned 16 and is learning to drive. The contrast results from at least one difference between the two. So Bob eats bananas, but Jill does not. So here we can feel more contrast. So we're looking at banana eating of two different agents, same as we did up in one, but the main difference is one does the banana eating and the other does not. There's also a thing called a double difference contrast, but let's go up. Important thing is information structure. Note that what we've changed in these examples so far has been the subject. Bob eats bananas, Jill eats bananas too. These are topic comment clauses, meaning you have a topic and what's newly asserted about it, the comment is what's most important. So Bob, subject, that's the topic, turning 16 and learning to drive, those two statements that I've asserted about him are what's most important. Bob eats bananas, but Jill does not. Again, the contrast is between the subjects, but what's asserted about them is still what's most important. So even though I have a contrastive shift to Jill isn't what's most important in the clause. What I assert about her is. So in topic comment clauses, it's what's newly asserted from a cognitive standpoint in terms of information structure. That's where the focal information is. Bob eats bananas, but Jill does not. You can hear that in my intonation. So contrast quite often is oriented with contrastive elements concern framing elements, not elements in the focal domain. Not always, but, and so as a result of that, maybe it's probably, typically you, especially with like with subjects and frame, you're going to find contrasting elements will generally play a framing role. Not always though, especially not in the epistles where you have argumentation and things going on. Let's look at a double difference contrast. So again, you still have the shared element between the two, but you have two differences instead of one. So our fruit eating is the shared element between both of these. But what's different is different agents or subjects, Bob and Jill, and then different patients. What is the fruit that they're eating? Bob eats bananas. So if you listen to my intonation, I'll put a secondary sentence intonation on the subject and primary sentence intonation on what's eaten. Bob eats bananas, but Jill eats apples. When you have a double difference contrast, one of the contrastive elements will, again, do that typical role of concerning the shift or the switch. But the second one in the double difference typically concerns something in the focal domain, in the proposition that's newly asserted. And that's what's going to have greater salience, because that initial element, on the one hand, we can look at Bob eats bananas and Jill eats apples in isolation, but as we look at them collectively, that statement about Bob eating bananas ends up taking on greater significance in that contrastive pair because of how it sets the stage for what you're about to say about Jill. Again, Jill eating apples isn't profoundly important, but the point is, in the rhetorical relationship between the two, we can look at these things individually, but we also need to look at these things collectively. So Bob eating bananas, I may know he eats bananas because I see him every day, but the point of saying it is to remind me of that, because I may or may not have remembered it, but it also sets the stage and serves as a foil for the statement that he's about to say about Jill eating apples, because of its importance. And now, finally, after 49 minutes, we're back around to Christoph's question about Galatians 2:12. And again, Lexham Discourse New Testament Display, it's just a helpful way for me to think about propositions. So here we have a couple different things going on. We have proto elthein tinas apo Jacobo. We have this situation before certain people from James came, before the coming of the people from James. From a cognitive standpoint, that's setting up a temporal frame of reference for what follows, but it's also doing something more. It's evoking the notion that there's going to be reference to sometime after these guys came. So again, this is where, one, the importance of having a cognitive linguistic component in your theoretical framework, but also looking at things more holistically in the passage to have a better sense of like why it is that this information is there. it may not be controversial or new or profound aha kind of moment that we learned that Peter used to eat with the Gentiles. But the fact that it's been situated in this context before the arrival, and that what we find in the next clause is basically the after that, once they've arrived, we have a double difference. So we have before the people arrive, and then after, and then we have what Peter used to do and what Peter does now. So each of these clauses in verse 12 is answering the same question: what did Peter do? But collectively, they're answering the question of, you have before this happened, after this happened, one difference. You have he'd eat with the Gentiles, and then he didn't eat with the Gentiles. He stopped eating with them, or withdrew and separated himself. And then we have the phobomenos tous ekperitomes, so the basically fearing the ones of the circumcision. So you actually have a rationale that's given for why he withdrew. That double difference contrast there is significant because the question that's being answered in verse 12, Paul could have just as easily, so again, thinking in terms of minimal pairs, we could say Paul could have just as easily said, Peter withdrew from eating with the Gentiles when the people from James arrived. That would have communicated the same propositional content, but without the same rhetorical impact. Because what Paul wants to focus on is the hypocrisy of what he did, that he used to do these things and then he didn't. And maybe that would have been okay. Maybe they had COVID and he needed to be wearing a mask and socially distance. Maybe there was some legitimate reason. Joking. But Paul's trying to bring out that the only thing that's changed are the peers that are looking at Peter and putting peer pressure on him, or that Peter's putting on himself. Nothing else. So then, from an information structure standpoint, in terms of the question, what Paul's not just answering, what did Peter do? That's what is being answered in each question. It's what he's answering is, why did Peter change? And that's what's profoundly different. And that's what's of significance. It is, why did Peter change his behavior? And he's done that in two parts. The first part of verse 12 is the foil. It's the setup to say, he used to do this. If Paul had just said, Peter didn't eat with the Gentiles, it wouldn't sound like that big a deal, unless we had the information that he used to. And then unless we had the information that the only thing that changed was the arrival of the people from James. And you'll notice that there's a double X and a check. Basically, this is a way of indicating that the function of Allah at verse 14, that's pivoting basically and saying, essentially, here's what Peter's behavior was like in this context of, before the men from James arrived and after. And then Paul is contrasting essentially his behavior, that when he was in that same situation and saw what was going on, and again, characterizing Peter as not being straightforward in the truth, he goes and confronts him to his face. So information structure at a local level, like what's being newly asserted in verse 12a, he used to eat with the Gentiles. So does Paul. Is that really that new? It's not really, but it's clearly marked in terms of the information structure. You have the adverbial element, the temporal adverbial element that's fronted creates a frame of reference for what follows. And it's a crucially important temporal frame of reference, but that doesn't mean it's the most important part. It provides the basis for what follows. But the other thing about natural information flow is once I've read verse 12a, everything in 12a becomes presupposed in my mental representation of the discourse because I now know it. I've read it. And everything I've read before this now becomes the basis for what follows. So we can analyze verse 12a in isolation and say, okay, this is a temporal frame of reference, the prepositional phrase or the infinitival clause. And what's newly asserted is he used to eat with the Gentiles. But that information then becomes the basis or frame of reference in a very kind of loose sense for the processing of verse 12b. But when they came, and notice you don't have another statement about who the they are in Eilthen. That's the thing that changes everything in terms of his behavior, leading to his withdrawing and separating himself. And then that in turn serves as the basis then for Paul's response in verse 14. And that's the whole reason he's telling the story. And in fact, the whole reason he goes back up and starts the story up in 1:14 or 1:12 or so. It's to come to this point to basically say, of all of the people who have heard the gospel and understood how things were supposed to work, Peter was the guy who had the information, and Paul is the one who has remained faithful to that mandate that they had. So that's a kind of an overview of information structure and the complexities of it. If you're interested in more information, about information structure generally, I would encourage you to pick up the Discourse Grammar of the Greek New Testament. If you've read that, that's meant to be kind of a prequel to Levinson's Discourse Features of the Greek New Testament. If you've read that and want a deeper dive into information structure, then I would strongly recommend Nicholas Bailey's dissertation on Fadic constructions. It's using the same model by Lambrecht, construction grammar, but fabulous work that I'd encourage you to look at. And then on the Facebook post that I'm going to post this on, or I'll reference over, there's been some other more recent work, again, by Klein, that was mentioned by someone, I can't remember who it was, but the point is, there will be more information that will kind of corroborate these kinds of things. Generally speaking, that the Lambrecht's ideas have been around since '94, and they've been clarified and sharpened, but not fundamentally overturned, and they've been borne out typologically, across numerous languages, not just English and German and Greek. But again, in looking at information structure, it's difficult. I mean, yes, you can have the principles of information structure to analyze a specific clause and to understand it, but to understand some of the motivations within the clause, the broader contextual factors absolutely have to be taken into account. And that's where it gets complex and where it gets messy. And that's where I recommend getting something like the Discourse Greek New Testament database, where a lot of the basic work has been done that allows you to step back and think about some of these higher level issues and how they fit together. So thanks for joining me. For those of the few who stayed through the whole thing, hope this was helpful, and hoping that we can at some point be able to spend some time on Facebook for a colloquium of some kind, where we could present some kind of ideas and then have some discussion about it. in a synchronous time, either through Zoom or Facebook Live or something.